Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Madhvi, we were discussing earlier, and you clearly mentioned that you're a mythic writer and not a mythologist. What makes you select a particular myth or story for your book? What are the characteristics or ideas that attract you to a particular myth? Is it their significance? Is it their staying power? I would love for you to elaborate.
Uh, Thank you. That's actually looks like a simple question, but it's quite a lethal one. Let me try and answer it. Um, Myths are usually associated with the heroes. This is the typical journey of a myth. Journey is actually the journey of a hero, and it starts out with it's an outward journey. The hero leaves his home, goes out into the world, faces challenges. There are conquests along the way, and then after a lot of trials and tribulations, he comes back with something which changes the society in which he lives. For example, Rama's exile. He is pushed out, and you know the story. He comes back and establishes what we call as Ramarajya, this golden glorious epoch. Now so the hero's journey is always about transformation, and it's about changing the scenario and bringing in something new and rejuvenating into the system, a kind of revolution. But this journey, though it is very enlightening and interesting, is one kind of journey. The journey that I personally find interesting is a very different one. It's a much more quieter one, and it's not so concerned with, transforming the world as it is with preventing the world from unraveling. This is a journey which is about sustaining the world, nurturing it, and ensuring its continuity. It's a much more quieter journey, and there are no rewards like the way the hero is rewarded. It's not a recognized journey, and but it interests me because it is largely the journey of women. The stories that I have focused on have always been about women from the epics, mythic women. Uh, there is Kunti, the mother of the Pandavas. There is Drishadwati, who is the wife of the legendary king Yayati, and there is Hidimbi, who is the Rakshasi wife of Bhima, the mother of, and she's the mother of Ghatotkacha. Between these three, you see sort of archetypes of a mother, a daughter, and a wife. And it's the journeys of these women that interest me. These journeys do not really start out at the heroic quest. It's more a journey undertaken through the body, and it is a journey through love, through motherhood, more importantly, and a journey, and through the web of relationships that is created around these women. Strangely, it is also a journey in which these women exercise choice given this entire universe which is around them, the web of relationships and duties and responsibilities. They, within that limited agency that they have, they do exercise choice. They do make decisions which are in themselves game changers. When they happen, we don't see them like that, but the later impact, the consequence is always that of a game changer. So it is actually the stories of these women that interest me. Now, the mythic element actually comes from, one part of it comes from the supernatural. How easily the supernatural enters their lives. It slips in. Durvasa gives a boon for services rendered to Kunti. And that boon then, she has a lifelong secret. It changes her entire life. Drishadwati has been given a body that renews itself after every childbirth. So that itself brings consequences. And Hidimbi belongs to the world of the supernatural, the magical. She is shapeshifter, phenomenally powerful woman, and so on. So the fantastical enters the lives of these women, but it does not make their stories fantastic. What it actually does is it deepens, it adds heft to their stories. It's almost like as if um, fate is binding these individual lives to a larger cosmic plan, which is what myths are all about. Now, when you look at them, there is a sort of a very early myth. We're talking about myths here. So there is a very early myth which actually kind of patterns itself in the lives of these women, and that is the myth of the earth itself. Prithvi or Bhumi was she is the mythical cow who is burdened by society, overburdened, exploited, and she is not given a chance to replenish. And it comes to the point where she stands before Brahma and pleads with him, save me, because I am completely broken now. I think since we live in this world where ecological concerns are very, very important, you can see what this story is in a way saying. So, as you know, is the raison d'etre of the entire Mahabharat, the idea of Bhar Avtaran, reducing the burden of the earth. And that is why they say the Mahabharat actually occurred, the deepest foundational myth of the. Now, the lives of this particular aspect of earth as an overburdened creature, overexploited, I see this patterned in the lives of these women, whether it's Gandhari, whether it's Kunti, Draupadi. It's more like these women become sites of extraction. What is extracted from them? From Kunti, it is those 5 heroes, the demigods, who from Drishadwati in Bride of the Forest, it is 4 lineages are revived, 4 great lineages are revived. From Hidimbi, you get the son, a great warrior, Ghatotkacha. So warriors, heroes, the revival of great dynasties, this is what these women actually contribute. And this is what we are told brings sort of stability in the cosmos and in our own world, in our own society. So their contribution is not insignificant at all, but it is kind of almost erased. It comes in, it's taken for granted. Yes, you are a woman, sacrifice is necessary, you make the sacrifice, then you move into the margins. And all 3 women actually move into the margins. So, what I have tried, and the myths, why these stories and why these mythical women have attracted me, is because I have tried to look for not for their redemption and not for their modernization or anything, but I feel that given a voice, they speak directly to us, and they tell us a different kind of journey, not the typical hero. They map an alternate journey, which is not about victory so much, not about bringing something really solid and contribute, but it's more about endurance. It's more about bearing witness to what has happened, and it is also about if told in their voices, when told in their voices, it's also about sort of redefining their identities, which I think is what is happening in the world today. That's why these particular myths have always been the myths that have interested me.
Good to hear about the alternate journey, Madhvi. I'm going to go on to the next question. Elopement conjures up images of love, passion, freedom, adventure, so many different things. And when we look at different mythologies, for example, Greek mythology, when we say the word elopement, we immediately think of the redhead Helen of Troy. We think of the, lion-haired Menelaus. We think of, Agamemnon. We have some memories attached to that. The same way, when we take Egyptian mythology, we're talking about the earth goddess Nut and the sky god Jeb. And you talk about their romance, where they could be together only for 5 days. So every mythology has a story of elopement. And somehow, as Indians, we've been always attracted to the, Western and Asian mythologies rather than our mythology. And I feel Indian mythology has some lovely stories. What does the word elopement bring to your mind? Can you tell me, Madhavi?
Well, the modern word elopement I think its origin is 16th century French or something. The word we are using just right now, elopement, which actually just means, it comes from the verb alloper, which means to leap off or to run away or to escape. So I think the modern sensibility, which is my sensibility to some extent, is that yes, oh, this is a runaway, you escape from one situation or one man into what you desire the world to be, the man that you want to marry or something like that. But in mythology, if I go deeper into mythology, I find in our mythology, I find a very different look at this concept of elopement. And it is more about how society has dealt with the idea of woman's desire, because that is central to the idea of elopement. This is the one area in which the woman's consent is very, very important. It is the probably the key factor. The woman has to consent to it. So how have we looked at it in mythology? Now our mythology has layers and layers and layers. So when you look at the entire narrative history of elopement, what you see is a changing societal attitude towards it. This is going to be a slightly longish answer because I want to bring up a couple of stories which start right from the beginning and then come, which will illustrate how elopement changes, the idea of elopement changes. So the first one, of course, is somewhere in the Padma Puran. I'm sure there'll be people who will know better than me, but this is where I found the story to be, and it is the story of Tara and Chandra. I don't know how many of you have heard this particular mythic elopement. Now, it's a very interesting story because it starts a battle. This battle is called the Tara Kamaya Yudh, which is translated loosely as the war fought for the love of Tara. Now, this is one battle. You have to remember the context, this is one battle in that almost 12 battles between the Devas and the Asuras. So this is happening at a cosmic level. We'll start with the cosmic level and then descend to earth slowly. So this happens at the cosmic level. And who is Tara? Now, Tara is the wife of Brihaspati, Jupiter, as we call the planet in English. And Brihaspati is the Raj Purohit of the Devas. He is a key figure for the Devas because there he keeps, through his rituals, he's a ritualist. He performs the yagnas and the sacrifices. Through these rituals, the power of the Devas is always maintained. So he's very, very, very important to Indra. Now, Tara's role as the wife of the Raj Purohit, she sits beside him. She is his Dharma Patni. She sits beside him when these rituals are performed, and she has a role to play. And without her, the rituals can't be done. But Brihaspati is so involved in his rituals that he doesn't pay enough attention to Tara. And she, like, many beautiful women who are not given sufficient attention by their husbands, she falls she's very easily taken in by the attention given to her by Chandra, the moon god, basically, Soma, Chandra. He's a very passionate. You look at the moon, you know that passion rises within you. That is the effect of the moon. So he is very he looks at her very ardently, and she responds to his attention. So when he decides to take her away, haran is the word which is used to carry her away, she quite happily jumps onto his chariot or whatever it is that he has and goes with him. And this is what we call elopement. And she lives openly with him. And, she's not bothered about, nobody is bothered about it too much except for Brihaspati, who's quite angry, And but he hides his anger. He goes to Indra and tells him, I can't perform the rituals anymore because my wife is gone, and unless she comes back, I can't. So Indra then says, well, okay, we'll have to do something because this is very important for our welfare, for the welfare of the Devas. So he tells Chandra, look, you have to return, Tara back to her husband. And Chandra says, you can ask her if she wants to go back. And Tara says flatly, no, I don't want to go back to him. I'm very happy where I am. Just leave me here. Now this becomes a bigger issue, and this is where the war starts. This is a cosmic war where where the Devas sort of try to force their writ, and on the other side, the Asuras, their enemies who are always waiting for a chance, supported by Brihaspati's equal on the other side, that is Shukracharya. They jump in, and this is a cosmic war, something like what is going on today, where everybody is on the brink of extinction, and everybody is nervous. And then they go to Brahma and plead to him, said, please do something now, so he's kind of mediates, and he tells Chandra, you have to let go of her. Now when Chandra says, okay, fine, I have to let go of her, Tara has no choice but to return to her lawfully wedded husband. She comes back and she says, it's found out that she's pregnant. Okay, so now there's another conflict altogether, because Brihaspati says the son is mine, and Chandra says, no, the son is mine. And Tara, maintains this very sphinx like silence through the entire process. So now what happens? Again, they are like fighting over it. And at this juncture, the consciousness which is growing in her womb, interrupts and says, Mother, I want to know who is my father. This is, as you know, this is Budh, Mercury, as as we say. Now he is supremely intelligent, and everybody says, look, you have to answer this question, even if you can't answer the other two men. And she says, well, the father is Chandra. So now Brihaspati is boiling mad, because not only has his claim to his son been taken, he's got egg all over his face or whatever. And he says, he gets very angry with Chandra, and he says, listen, you are going to be cursed. I am cursing you that you will not have a definite gender. You will not be male, you will not be female. You will be a neuter. This is a terrible, terrible curse, and it's very unfair, because the poor child did nothing to, earn it. So the gods again see Brihaspati's, blood pressure is rising. So they tell him that, please calm down. From now on, whatever else happens, we regard Buddha as your son. He is your son. Henceforth, it does not matter who owns the field. The crop belongs, the produce belongs to the legal owner of the field. In this case, the pati. Now this is actually a game changer, because here a woman is made into somebody's property. All right. This particular story is interesting because it tells us a couple of things. It tells us about how gender equations used to be earlier. See, Tara is never ever blamed, never accused, never called names for what she does. But what is recognized about her is that female desire, what is recognized about female desire is that it is inflammatory. It can bring the world to the brink of a war. So this is the first time you see unease with the idea of female desire at the cosmic level, and hence this decree which is granted, that it will she is a field and you are the owner of the field, the legal husband. And now we come down to the earthly realm, where we have another story found in the Adi Parv of the Mahabharata, and this is the story of Yayati. I've sort of dealt with this story in Bride of the Forest, my second novel. And in this particular story, Yayati he's a legendary king who has a relationship, an illicit relationship, with his wife's maid. Now, who is this maid? Her name is Sarmishtha. She is an asura. So here you find something different happening. You have a Kshatriya, you have an asura. This is a relationship which is going on. Children are produced. The relationship is hidden till the day it actually surfaces. And then Yayati is cursed. He's given a terrible curse, but more than the curse itself, his entire lineage is fragmented. So, what this story is telling us is that female desire, when excessive, can cause severe damage to your lineage, to your entire, and go on for generations and generations. Again, this is a reinforcement of the first idea that female desire is being acknowledged, but its consequences are being measured out. And here is where we see what elopement is really doing. Now we come to a later stage, and this is actually the story which you mentioned of Rukmani Haran. Now, this is the era of Krishna. And here we find this particular story in which Rukmani, who is the princess of Vidarbha, writes a letter to Krishna saying, I have never met you, but I have heard so much about you and I love you very deeply. Please, my brother is marrying me off to Shishupal is who her brother is marrying her off to. I don't want to get married to him. Come and save me. Krishna does exactly that. He takes her, lifts her off in a chariot and takes her. Now, this would look like abduction to you, but it is with her consent. And what then happens is Krishna marries her. He, from being, a lead a tribe, becomes a king. She is the queen. There is the whole legalized framework around them. So after the fact of elopement, they are married, and this is their relationship is completely regularized. This, in a way, also reflects the idea that the agency of the woman is very important. Her desire is very important. Articulating that desire as her truth, writing as a form of self expression and as your truth, has to be respected. And also, because this is really showing two fingers to her brother, it's also saying that when dharma gets repressive and forces you to do something, it is this is what is right. Desire has to play the woman's desire counts. Here desire becomes something very interesting. Same thing, very briefly, Krishna engineers another elopement of his friend Arjun with his sister Subhadra, which you must have seen. It's in paintings. Now this is also politically arranged. So elopement, when it serves a political purpose, is perfectly all right, is what we are being told. The last story is actually when things changes, and this is the story which is found in Bhagavad Puran. It is the story of a princess named Usha. She is the princess of a kingdom called Sonitpura, which is your modern day Tezpur. Her father is Banasur. He is a disciple, a devotee of Lord Shiva, and Shiva has been very kind to Banasur. Now, Usha one night has a dream in which she sees a very, very handsome young man whom she has never met in her life before. And she wakes up from the dream completely besotted. Now, you always in an elopement, you will see you need an aid or a support. This support in her case happens to be a friend of hers whose name is Chitrilekha. That name should tell you something. Chitrilekha is not only a magician, in the sense she has magical powers, but she's also an artist. And this, it's very good because she draws up an entire lineup of all the portraits of all the kings of Aryavrat and says, which one of these was the one you saw in your dream? So then Usha looks and she says, yes, he's the person I saw in my dream. Now, who is he? So she says, Chitralekha says, that is, his name is Anirudh. He is the son of Pradyumna, who is and he is also the son of Krishna of Dwarka. So he is a prince of Dwarka. And obviously, Dwarka, one end of the country, Tezpur, another end of the country. How do these two meet? So here Chitralekha steps in again and says, when he's asleep, I will transport him and bring him to your palace, which is exactly what she does. When he's asleep, she takes Anirudh and brings him to Sonitpura, and he meets Usha. Of course, they fall passionately in love, and they remain together. Now, Banasur hears of this man who is staying in his daughter's palace, and he gets hopping mad, and he also has magical powers. After all, through his magical powers, he imprisons Anirudh. There's chaos in Dwarka. Where is the prince? Where is the prince? And then they find out, oh God, he's imprisoned there. So Krishna takes out the entire Yadava army and they go to, and there's a terrible battle in which Shiva also sort of fights. So you can see here the fight between the Shaivites and the Vaishnavites, which is happening. And in this fight, eventually Krishna wins and he defeats Banasur, who has 1,000 arms. He cuts off all his arms till Shiva pleads and says, just leave him, spare his life. He's my devotee. I'm asking you to do this. So he leaves 4 of his arms and he spares his life. And what happens next? The couple are married off. So you can see that from Rukmani Haran to Subhadra Haran to Anirudh Haran, rather, one can say, it is the situation ends in marriage. So this is how we see in mythology, they are uncomfortable with the idea of female desire, but if it can be safely managed by marrying the couple involved, then it is accepted by society.
Thank you, Madhavi. You've very beautifully traced the journey of elopements, if I may say so, very succinctly and humorously. Now I'm going to touch upon another topic, elopement versus abduction. There's a very thin line between both of them, and women's agency is very central in this. We say abharan when somebody is kidnapped, taken away without bail, but also there's a Sanskrit word for elopement called haran. So just the ab seems to be the difference between both the words. And also to make matters more complicated, there were different kinds of marriages in Indian mythology, as far as I can see it. And to top matters, elopement always had to end in a marriage. If you read the Amma Chitrakatha, they eloped, they married, they lived happily ever after.
Yeah.
It just ends there. So I would love, if you could talk further on this.
Yeah, actually, this is very interesting because the question, as Lakshmi said, elopement has to end in a marriage. So, what are you actually? You're running away from a man, your father, your brother, but you're running to another man and you're running into marriage. So, is this really freedom? Is elopement a form of freedom? To me, the answer seems no. It's fleeting. It's a momentary sense of freedom which you have, that you've made a choice, because you have made a choice here. And here is where the difference between what you said, elopement and abduction, comes in. It is all a matter of consent. It revolves around that. That is the central thing. In elopement, there is consent. Whether she is carried away or whether she decides to meet the fellow outside, whatever she does, the fact is she is doing it of her own free will. This is elopement. Abduction, on the other hand, looks like elopement, because you carry the girl away, haran and abharan, but you carry her against her wishes. Sita and Ravan, that is an abharan. Jayadratha and Draupadi, that is an abharan. Because throughout she is screaming and protesting. Also in abharan, there is this thing of fighting off somebody, her kin, people who run to protect her. You fight them and you take her away. Now, as Lakshmi said very correctly, that the whole thing of elopement has to end in those days. It had to end in marriage. The woman could not be left let alone. She had to belong either to this camp or to that camp, but it had to be, if she was here, she had to be in a marriage. So probably to accommodate such situations, there were a number of marriages according to the Shastras. Very briefly, there are 2 categories. One is the prashast marriage or the approved marriage, in which there are 4 categories where you have different ways in which the family supports the marriage completely, and the father gives away the girl. But there is another set called aprashast, or disapproved or unrighteous marriages, where there are again 4 marriages. That in one of the first one amongst them is the Gandharva Vivaha, which is the closest that we call to consent between 2 people without taking the consent of their families. It's only between the 2 people. It's a private affair. Dushyant and Shakuntala, that story which you all would have definitely know, is an example of a Gandharva Viva. Again, when you look at the consequences of that story, Dushyant completely forgets. You can see here the message that is being given is it's not something which is very nice. This can happen. There are not so good consequences even to this Gandharva Viva, this idea of consent. The next one, of course, is Paishacha marriage. Then there is Asura marriage, and then there is one called the Rakshasa marriage, which is literally what abduction is. Against the consent of the girl, against the will of the family, you kidnap the girl and take her away by force, fighting her relatives, which is what you see also in the Mahabharata when Bhishma takes away the princesses of Kashi. And but all these four forms of marriage, of whatever, lifting the girl away, have to end in marriage. Now this is like almost like saying, okay, we've taken the girl, but we restore her honor by marrying her. So she is forced into the marriage, or her marriage, or she consents to her marriage, whichever way it is. So elopement per se becomes a form of marriage. It is different from Swayamvar, which is actually choosing amongst a curated audience. Your father puts up 12 princes and you decide which one you. So yeah, it's only a selection process. In Gandharva Viva, you actually choose without any witnesses to get married. So elopement definitely comes within the range of the marriage.
I'm glad you explained this because a lot of people think elopement is something different from marriages, when we generally talk about ideas. So, to add another perspective to women's agency in elopement, we have Anuja Chandramouli talking to us for a couple of minutes. Please just focus on the screen.
Hi everyone, I'm Anuja Chandramouli, author and mythologist. And regarding today's discussion on elopement in mythology, what can I say? It was considered very, very, very romantic, and you have forbidden love and lovers risking so much to triumph against impossible odds, and we are all rooting for them, and it is so much fun until it isn't. Because at the heart of this discussion, we have the question of consent, that a woman's choice is sacrosanct. The epics make it clear that there will be hell to pay if a woman's will is thwarted, if she's not allowed to follow the dictates of her heart. When it comes to my work with Indian mythology, I have a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, it is all about preservation. On the other hand, it is about reformation. For these stories have a certain inherent value. They are an inherited treasure for all of us, and I love that we are all harvesting the seeds planted by generations past, and adapting mythology to suit the needs of the present age. And regarding the need for reformation, it is pretty obvious, because I feel that though the stories are very, very empowering, they have been used to enslave rather than empower, especially when it comes to women and other minorities. And therefore we need to restore the essence of these stories and let the lesser known voices shine through, and let's not allow mythology to be politicized and weaponized. We have the legend of Amba, of course, where she is abducted from her own Swayamvara against her will by Bhishma on behalf of his younger brother. But she rejects Bhishma, and she makes it clear that her heart belongs to Shalva, and she secures permission to go and unite with Shalva, who unfortunately rejects her. And Amba's plight is very pitiable, and it translates into tragedy, not just for herself but for Bhishma as well, although it is part of a greater plan. So the message is clear. And another thing though, on the flip side of this coin, the epics also make it clear that at no point in history was a woman's choice prioritized above all else. And we see the ramifications of this, the violence which follows in the real world today as well. Now, returning to the epics, let us talk about a very famous elopement where Krishna carried away Rukmini at her own request. Rukmini's hand had been promised by her brother Rukma to Shishupala, and she was dead set against this match. So she got a message out to Krishna in secret, and he did the needful, but she ended up burning a lot of bridges, though she never looked back, and there was a bit of ill will and hard feelings between Rukma and Rukmini, and that extended to Krishna as well. And later in the epic, you see how Krishna helps Arjuna when Arjuna reveals that he is in love with Subhadra, whose hand has been promised by Balarama, who is her brother, to Duryodhana. And Krishna helps, and he tells Arjuna that Subhadra also loves you, so the honorable course is for you to carry her away. And Arjuna does just that, and Subhadra is shown holding the reins of the chariot to indicate that Arjuna is the man she loves. And the backlash from this continues to play out with the children, next generation as well, because Abhimanyu comes to know that Balarama's daughter Sashireka wishes to marry him, though Balarama, as a form of appeasement, has promised Sashireka's hand to Duryodhana's son Lakshmana Kumar. And Krishna intercedes again, and he gets Gatotkacha to help Abhimanyu and Sashireka unite. And we see the very, very tragic backlash that followed on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, where the rivalry between Abhimanyu and Lakshmana Kumar comes to a head right in the middle of Drona's deadly Chakra Vyuha. And Abhimanyu kills Lakshmana, which leads to a furious Duryodhana giving the command for his own nephew to be slaughtered using unfair means in battle. And as I said, we see this violence spilling over in the real world also. Our papers are full of news about dishonor killings, because then and now a lot of people simply cannot wrap their head around the fact that a woman has the right to choose her own lover or spouse. You see, there are so many bitter fathers, brothers, relatives, friends who deliberately kill lovers in cold blood, and it is shameful that it still happens in this day and age. So I think these stories ask us to introspect a little more closely as a society and as individuals, that we need to love in a world where love is such a precious commodity, and there is so little of it, unfortunately.
Thank you, Anuja. I think she completed the circle, basically said, what we wanted to say. And I wanted to ask a question, Madhavi. What is the aftermath of this very romantic act? What happens after, they are eloped and all the happily ever after happens? And I want to say that, the myths or the contemporary news, if you take, the taboos still remain about elopement. There is always, familial and societal problems, and the values of honor and, even pride seems to be pinned to the women in the households. They have to take the brunt of it, unfortunately. So I would like you to comment on it.
Yes, this is interesting because as we've sort of discussed, it's clear that in our mythology and at an earlier stage, a place was given for women's desire. It was acknowledged. It was understood that it comes from a liminal space in your dreams, or it's a form of self-expression, and it had to be negotiated. But somewhere along the line, I think maybe around 300 CE to 900 CE, which is the time when the Smritis, the Manu Smriti, and all the other Smritis, the Dharma Shastras, were being put down. At this particular point, they started becoming a little more strict about how to look at women's desire. Up till now, it has been accommodated, managed, and that is how society has gone ahead. But here at this juncture, it is tied very clearly to the family honor, to the lineage, to the male lineage. It is tied to the caste group as such. And it is also tied to her body, the idea of her virginity, and so on. And, these concepts come in. And then it becomes a stranglehold, and it becomes on her. So she who in Tara's time was never not judged at all, in Sharmishta is not judged at all. It's accepted almost like it is this is the way it will be, because desire is after all rises in the body and it rises in the mind and so on. And you can't, you can't you can't do anything other than regulating it. Here the regulation becomes very strict. So from then on, we see that the idea of elopement is something which is very closely connected with family honor because of the lineage, because of the caste thing, and women are the ones who actually are the who have to pay the price for it.
They are the main victims, you've
Yeah.
clearly put it. And love has never been a private act in India. And we find when we look at the statistics, elopements are up by 80%. But the funny part is, are they really eloping? It includes people missing, disappearing, murdered, they vanish for various reasons. There's also the question of, the autistic people who are suffering from something, they vanish, they also come under the list. So since there are no proper statistics for it, I had asked Supreme Court counsel Mr. Ajay Katkal to talk about elopements in present times, so we can listen to him and think about the very grim reality behind this very fantasy tale that's told to us.
My take on criminal elopement is A, there is a complete absence of a definition or a legal mechanism which would criminalize or penalize elopement as such. Now, what is very important before we define elopement is to decipher which relationship is genuine or which relationship is one that is driven by fraud and misconception of fact. Unless and until there is a mechanism to decipher, put into different boxes a relationship which is genuine, which is driven by the consent and knowing, the knowledge of the individual who are involved in the relationship, and a relationship where we see traces of misconception or undue influence, we will not be able to really have a framework of criminal elopement. In the absence of a statute, the law as it stands today, in the event of an incident of elopement, often the family members of an individual who are opposed to such a relationship would label it as an elopement, and the recourse that they are made to undergo or to take up is to file a complaint before the jurisdictional police, and in the event of any inaction by the police, to file a petition before the High Court seeking the issuance of a writ in the nature of a habeas corpus. Now, what happens in a petition for habeas corpus is essentially the state machinery is invited to trace the individual, and once the individual is brought to the court and the individual expresses that such a relationship is out of his or her own will, the scope of judicial intervention becomes very, very limited, except for probably going an extra step in advising the individuals involved to say that it would be nice of them to consider the opinion of their family members before they progress or proceed further in the relationship. Now, while there are cases, most of which are purely out of the consent of the individual, and once such an individual or the individuals involved have crossed the age of majority, which is defined under the Act, the scope of judicial intervention becomes very limited. Now, in my view, what is even more concerning for me at this point of time is, given the exposure which people have who have not even crossed the age of majority, well, they may have entered into the relationship knowing the consequences or the flavor of the equation which they share with the other individual. Now, when such a relationship invites resistance from the family members, out of the emotional charge that the opposing family members may have against such an equation, very often the individual who is involved, who may not have attained the age of majority, is compelled to file a case, police complaint, rightly or wrongly, for invoking the provisions of the POCSO Act, which is essentially a social legislation to protect innocent children who have been victimized with sexual offences. So such complaints are on the rise as on this day, and unless and until we have a mechanism to weed out such false complaints, which complaints are filed without even realizing the impact it would have on their own children, I think we are entering a dangerous territory. While it is important to have a statute to deal with criminal elopement, it's very important to have a mechanism also to decipher which complaints are genuine or which complaints are motivated only through sheer pressure of the family members of the individuals involved. Now, this framework which I referred to could be in the nature of a preliminary inquiry that could be conducted by the police, which preliminary inquiry may entail in it to record the statements of the family members, record the statements of the persons who are involved, and also, most importantly, to see the trajectory of the offences committed. So very often what happens is a relationship could have spanned for several years, and after the lapse of say 4 to 5 years, a complaint is filed. Now, merely for the fact that the nature of the complaint would involve sexual offences, the policemen are compelled to immediately register the FIR for the fact that it is a cognizable offence and it's an offence under the special statute, and the procedure would require having medical examinations. So, my view is that before such procedures are put in place, unless and until a preliminary step is taken up by the police to examine the genuineness or otherwise of the complaint, my view is special statutes which are passed and tailored to deal with specific instances are misused by the public at large. And the courts and the entire machinery which is put in place by the statute becomes overburdened by such false and frivolous complaints, and less attention is given to genuine ones. Well, to conclude, I would say that the definition of elopement has got to be put in place by the legislator, and B, the special statutes which are there at this point of time, which the procedures of which become an offshoot of such elopements, have got to be put in place, the SOPs have got to be put in place to enforce the provisions of the special statute. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ajay. I know that account sounded very dry and long in comparison to a discussion of mythology, but we had to listen to the picture of what's happening presently. We hear so many stories. We grew up listening to grandparents telling us very romantic stories of King Prithviraj carrying away Samyukta. But ultimately, when you look at it, you do not feel an ounce of romance or freedom or women's liberty from his words. I'm not trying to put him down. It sounds dry as dust when we talk about elopement. So I'm going to now shift topics. I'm going to talk about how mythology affects and influences every practitioner of art, dance, music, literature. Everywhere you see a little bit of mythology. I'm going to talk about the romance books. I would like Madhavi to say a few words. Basically, we've all read, grown up reading, George Deyers and Barbara Cartlands, and everybody eloped to the Gretna Green. And even recently, we have like contemporary novels, which just talks about there is elopement, a memoir by Deepika, and Prem Chowdhury has written about eloping couples, and we have a lot of books on that. And this romance, for the romance novelists, it seems to be a backdrop, a tertiary character, something that they carry the plot along. So I feel that romance books especially talk a lot about elopement. I would like Madhavi's views on this.
We've got Nandita here with us, who actually writes beautiful romance novels and is probably better qualified than me to talk about elopement, because I have perhaps the closest I have come to writing about elopement is in the context of Hidimbi and Bhim, which is a temporary marriage which can be viewed as an elopement too, if you want to put that lens on it. Other than that, I would say that yes, we have grown up with the idea of Georgette Hare, writing about elopements. It's very romantic. It's when you're at that age, it seems like the perfect thing to do, to run away and to rebel, because it is an age concerning, where rebellion is almost natural. It's in your hormones at that time, and it's always a romantic getaway. But even in those novels, it's not really the recommended thing. However, you mentioned, Lakshmi, about how mythology is influences romance, and here again, I am drawn to one very, very interesting concept, which I think Aparna and Janani will probably be better able to illustrate it, but I can just briefly mention. And this is Bharat Muni and his wonderful, wonderful creation, the Natya Shastra, which talks about rasas. And I mean, maybe they can talk a little bit about it, and when they come to it, I think most of us will know what the what rasas are all about, the navarasas which we have. And the whole idea is that in the audience, or in the performance, and through the performance in the audience, you have to evoke certain combinations of feelings, Trishringar ras, which is also about, about beauty, it's about love; Karuna ras, and Veera ras, which is an essential part of elopement, because you have to have a man who is active enough to run away with a girl. Then you have to have a loving girl. So the rasas just play out in the elopement trope beautifully, and probably that's why we like it, because as an audience we are transported, but we don't have to bear the consequences that we just heard, the going to the legal. So it's very, very nice at that level, that performance gives us this space where we can elope, you know
There's a short video by Nandita, and I would love to invite Aparna on stage, our next guest. She is a storyteller, and her work mainly focuses on mythology. Please come up on stage. Nandita is just talking about the rasa of romance. Since she is a romance writer, I thought somebody should put the two bits of romance into it. So
Hi, I'm Nandita Bose, and this is my contribution to this beautiful talk on elopement. I would actually simplify this by saying elopement is the beginning of a bold journey. It is a time when the woman decides, I have had enough of all your opinions, or of you trying to lead my life, or telling me how to live. And this is just another step forward for the woman. What recourse does a woman have when she falls in love across castes, communities, age, or whatever else factors that would enrage her parents? She has no option but to forget her old life and begin anew. This trope is all too familiar to us. All romance writers deal with the loneliness of women who want to stand for themselves, who want to think for themselves, and who want to carve their own life out for themselves. So elopement is a physical thing, but notionally, all women, in some sense, elope. I do recall faintly that one of Mrs. Bennet's daughters in Pride and Prejudice had eloped. And I think that as a secondary or tertiary character, the elopement works. It worked in this case. I think her name was Lydia. In Lydia's case, to showcase Mrs. Bennet's foolishness. But elopement is very critical for us to examine why it happens. Elopement is the final stand you take against oppression.
thank you, Nandita. I think that completes our statement on the romance bit. Now we are going to quickly jump over to folklores. Because when we talk about myths, we can't ignore folklores because folklores have somehow crept into myths and myths have somehow crept into folklores. Madhvi and I were discussing a very interesting trope, that is Romeo, Romeo, where art thou? Madhvi said, I don't remember this trope being there in any myths. I don't think any god stood under the balcony of a woman and asked to be let up. Then it suddenly struck me. They're all in the folklores. All the beautiful love stories are in the folklore. So instead of, I don't want to waste your time because I'm not an expert storyteller. So this folklore is a piece of poetry. It's written by Maulana Dawood. The period is between the 13th century and 16th century. I would love for Aparna, expert storyteller, to talk about this story.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Okay, so folklores uh, uh, are bits of stories that might have happened around us, but we make it into a very grandiose scale. So our story begins, of course, like everything else, we have a king. His name is Sahadeva, not to be confused with the Mahabharata Sahadeva. Just happens that his name is Sahadeva, and he has this gorgeous, beautiful daughter. Of course, we're having a story, so the daughter has to be very, very beautiful. And so, yeah, I mean, like every part, I mean, like, if you just look at her eyes, they look, one would get mesmerized and so on and so forth. And very imaginatively, the father names the daughter Chand. So Chand grows up, and then again, she's a princess. So in kingdoms those days, how we all even today have stories is because of storytellers. But storytellers are a mischievous lot. So even in those days, so there was this storyteller. He comes, this bard comes, sees this beautiful princess, and of course wants to please the king, and therefore starts singing praises of this beautiful girl. He should have just stopped with this one kingdom. Without doing that, he goes from kingdom to kingdom, singing praises about, because again, we also do the same thing, right? We have one story for one audience. We know the audience is there. We just copy paste the same story. This is what this bard had also done. He copy pasted the same story. But what happened was he was singing praises of this beautiful princess. Now, everybody heard about this fantastical, gorgeous, drop dead beauty called Chand, and they wanted to meet her now. There was this king, Rupchand, and he decided that I'm a great king, therefore I deserve this princess. I want Chand. Why waste time? Go ask the father. No father is ever going to say yes, like, yeah, please marry my daughter. So he decides, I will invade the kingdom. Now, King Sahadev, who's Chand's father, realizes that this is going to happen. And he realizes that he's also not very strong. So he employs another person. All right? He's known as Lor. And he asks him, can you defend? And sure enough, Lor comes. He's known as Veer Lor. He comes and he defeats Roop Chand, the one who's fallen in love with Chand. And now Chand is besotted. Oh my God, there is this guy who's come and he's won over, fought for me against this old king. And they fall in love. And of course, fall in love, and she's the princess. Now, this man is very strong. Laur is extremely strong. He manages, can defeat an army and so on and so forth. But he belongs, in their various stories, it's a folklore. So everybody has a different version of who he is, but he is no prince. So obviously the king is like, I'll employ you to defeat and protect my daughter. I'll pay you for it, but I certainly don't want to give my daughter to you. So there is this beautiful romance where she looks down and she's the high princess. So how do you depict high princess? Obviously she's in a tower. You'll have it in all, from Rapunzel onwards, they're all, the women are always on these high towers, and these men are then, they have to climb up and find this beautiful girl or get her down. Somehow or the other, they manage that and they decide that they want to run away. Very, very beautiful, sounds very nice. Of course, there's no love story without any complication. Complication here is our hero, the Lor, is married. He has a wife. This woman is like, I sacrificed my life for you. Poetic way of saying that I do the jhadu poncha bartan and here you're romancing with another woman. How dare you? So she employs, these traveling performing arts people are very, very helpful that way. So this So this time, what she does is she employs somebody known as Surjan. He says, "You go find out what's happening," and he gets all the dope. That this is what is happening, and she's the wife's name is Maina, and she's extremely distraught that her husband has left her, and she's trying to get him back. These two, of course, have escaped. They've gone into the forest, and everything that you can imagine. There's a snake bite. Chand almost dies, and Laura is like, "I cannot live without her. So I also want to kill myself." And there is also this yogi who comes, hears the story, and revives Chand. Then it goes on till there's also a gambling. Lore gambles away. So our poor Mahabharata is not the only one that is where men gamble away women. This folklore also has where he gambles everything, including the woman. But the woman is very blonde. Chand is extremely beautiful. So she charms her way out of the gambling debt and revives herself. Being a folklore, it goes on and on and on and on and on. Depends on whose version you hear. You don't know where the story ends.
Yeah, because there are and the funny part of it, there is 5 manuscripts, but none of them have endings. It's like somebody went and deliberately ripped all the endings out. So, like all myths, we have to say she became a second wife. She smiled. She lived happily ever after, and the story ends. And I would love to show you the inscription in the folios. The first inscription shows the bard singing at Roopchand's court. And then the second inscription shows the fight between Roopchand and Lore. And the third inscription, there's a huge feast. Of course, there has to be a wedding feast, and it's always sinister. And the fourth inscription is the balcony scene where he says, she lets down the rope, he goes out, she acts very coy, and she doesn't want to talk to him. He's uttering romantic words to her. And then it leads to the fight between Chanda and Lore. And the god himself evicts the temple. He says, "This is too much, I can't take this." So he leaves, "Please knock yourself out," And then it ends with the last one, which is, which we can take a typical ending from, like Maina became resigned and said, "You will be the second wife," whatever. The set of inscriptions are available at the Chandigarh Museum website in case any of you want to take a deeper look. Thank you for all the attention. Now we will request the other guests to come up on stage. Janni Mulli, she's a Bharatanatyam practitioner, someone who works a lot with mythology, and she's going to do a trajectory of all the different Nayikas, for us. So I hope you will hear.
Yes, so the arts, we saw elopement as something that happens very quickly, or at least we usually understand it as something that's swift, happens in the night when nobody's watching, and it's a very, very quick thing to happen. But I think what the arts does for us is to examine everything that leads up to that moment of elopement. So with dance or poetry or music, we have this freedom of taking one split second and opening it up and elaborating it as if that was an entire year or an entire lifetime even. So that's what happens in poetry. We take that one moment from a person's life and keep digging deeper into who this person is. What was she feeling? What were her emotions? What was her state of mind? Why was she besotted by this person? Why was she in a loveless marriage, maybe? And one could go on and on and on. And that really is the art of Abhinaya, where you keep exploring and exploring. You go into internal conversations, you go into dilemmas that the woman has, or maybe what society had to say. You go into contexts of geography, of timelines. And it's a very fascinating world. So for the sake of discussion today, I've picked the Parakiya Nayika. Now, taking off from what you mentioned about the woman has to belong somewhere. She's either in this camp or in that. And the Parakiya Nayika refers to the heroine. And the Parakiya means that she belongs to the other. So either by way of marriage, she's married to one man, but she's in love with another, or by way of societal rules, that she may be unmarried, but she has guardians around her who obviously don't approve of the lover. So either way, she's the Parakiya. And So, if I were to introduce one of them, a strategist. Hmm? So, this woman is a strategist. She sent her husband away on work and she's inviting her lover home. And she says, Samayamide rara. This is the time. You must come in quickly. But this lover is quite a fool. He's still dilly-dallying at her doorstep. And she says, Tamasincha kura. Come, don't hesitate. Now he says, well, your in-laws are there or your husband might come. She says, I've sent him on a long trip. He's not going to come back anytime soon. And my in-laws, were they too old, they're deaf, they're blind, they won't know a thing. And she says, okay, wait. I'll shut the door. Now come in. But the entire song goes on where she's continuously telling him, Kamalavairi Sanudim China, if the moon goes down, the husband will return. At least now you come in. He doesn't listen. Then she says, I dreamt of you last night. You and I were together. Now come in. And he still. So the song ends, but the lover doesn't come. So this is the strategist's plan gone wrong. Another Parakiya Naika, the clandestine meeting in the middle of the night. And there are umpteen number of songs of, say, Radha even taking off her anklets, taking off her bangles, taking off even her tinkling earrings so that nobody is going to hear her. And she goes in the middle of the night to meet Krishna, just for that one moment. And poets will beautifully emphasize how that one moment is equal to eternity. And we live in that fantasy world of creating that eternal moment and eternity in the moment for Radha and Krishna. But there's also the cheeky Parakiya. Okay, so she's not the heroine. She's the friend. She's taking a message from the heroine to the hero. But what does she do? She has an affair with the hero. Okay, so now this is a Parakiya at a whole different level. And she comes back obviously with telltale signs. She's not smart enough to wipe off these telltale signs. And she comes back, and in this beautiful Swadi Tirunal Padam, the friend, this heroine, the original heroine is saying, Kamini Mani Sakhi Tavada Mukham. Why are you sweating? And she says, oh, the sun was so sharp. That's why. And she says, okay, but why is your kumkuma off? Oh, my, this pallu, it was just flying off. And it hit my kumkuma and it smeared. And she says, okay, then, but why is your hair is always neatly braided? Why is it so disheveled? I told you, no, wind completely messed up my hair. So this goes on. She creates ridiculous excuses for everything that has happened. But one Naika that always has me in splits is the woman whose lover has come in. He's not dilly-dallying at the door. He's come in the night. But this is a chatterbox, Parakiya Naika. So she's chatting and chatting and chatting with him, and the sun comes up and the rooster has crowed. Now the entire town is up. So she says, so after all, then he has to leave, obviously. So without anything having happened, he leaves in a hurry. And she goes to a friend and says, Chedaro nasamivato cheri matadentalo kodi kuse ayyo. What to do? The rooster crowed, and nothing ever happened. But these are all tropes that take us into like you said, you elope into another place where we're not dealing with practical realities of legal systems and societal judgment. And it also gives, I think, as artists, gives us a little bit of a space to empathize with human emotion a little bit more. And I think on a slightly more deeper level, the state of being Parakiya is not just a person. That these are moments that all of us experience of having to just escape, of having to just do away with responsibilities and getting rid of things that are bind us down. And philosophically, that's taken to another level where they say the state of being Parakiya is about the intention to unite with the divine beyond societal restrictions. And so a lot of poetry around Krishna Bhakti delves into this idea of the state of the Parakiya, of wanting to elope away from the mundane and to reach the divine. Yeah. So
Thank
a
you,
few
Janvi.
different
That was
shades.
very beautiful. We really enjoyed it. Instead of giving very pompous closing statements and very literary thoughts, I thought it'd be better to open to audience questions. Before that, I would like to thank my guests, audience, tech team, that's Prajita, and of course, moral support, Mr. Subodh Sankar. So they are very important for any event. And second thing I would say is, if you tell the younger generation about myths, they say, you're talking about a myth, bro. They are referring to something that's not real, but that's something far from truth. Actually, mythology is something that connects us through ages in our cultural consciousness. So I think with that closing statement, we open out to audience questions. Please feel free to attack the individuals,
I thank you, Lakshmi. That was great fun. Thanks to everybody. I should start off by saying that my own parents eloped in 1959.
Wow.
I actually it was not really a question, but I'd love your thoughts on the whole business of female choice in the in the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So, for example, there are many instances. I mean, starting with Hidimba, who chose to stay back in the forest and bring up Ghatotkacha, or the examples of when Arjun went to the east and Ulupi and Chitrangada and their children, or even Tara, like Vali's wife, who actually stayed with Sugriv and brought up Bali's son Angad, who became such an important part of the whole sequence. So there are very many examples of women sort of making their choices with their children, with their spouses in different ways, which all had pretty good outcomes in a way, which are not necessarily catastrophic. So I don't know how you think about all of these situations.
Madhavi, I think you're the right person to answer.
No, as you said, women's choices, this is actually what is very interesting in all the examples that you've given. Let's just look at Hidimba and her choices. Within the, those are, when you look back at the story, you see these are the very natural choices, even though they happen to be very strong choices, and in mythology, whatever the choice that you make, it is somehow connected with that larger cosmic plan. So I feel that, as you've said, women making certain choices is in our mythology. It represents the fact that there was definitely a time earlier, and it is sort of being replayed again to some extent today, when women did have the choice. And again, now we see a whole range of marriages coming in, a whole range of situationships, I think is the word. Yeah, coming in again, because the women are being empowered differently. But the choice is now coming back to them. And again, it's interesting that we are, in a way, are we going back to what we were, not judging them, but saying, let's see how society can accommodate this new reality. And to me, that looks like myth playing itself out but in a new morphed, new improved version, I would say. Does that answer your question?
Hi, I actually came a little late, so I missed like 15 minutes. So, but I have a question. So, I was reading a book called Indian Love, which was written around like 2014, and it captures like the idea of how Kama Sutra and Manusmriti and other like these text-based scriptures shows the change in the narrative of love, relationship, and how it flows. So, my question was that does the outcome that Manusmriti sort of became like one of the prevalent textbook during like if I'm not wrong, like when the Britishers came, and it became more prevalent, and Kama Sutra was sidelined in a lot of ways. Does that change the outcome of how elopement was looked into, as if like the power imbalance which started coming with different scriptures taking the first step, and the whole angle of elopement changing in that narrative? Because we look into Krishna and Radha as a very divine thing, but now if we see like the whole change which has happened from, let's say, something like a movie like NH10, which shows like the harsh reality, uh, is it because like there was a change, like subtle changes which happened in the textures and stuff?
Thank you. Uh, so definitely there has been a change. Our idea of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable definitely has been shaped by colonization. So that even practices that if you were to delve into your family history, and if you have the opportunity of talking to grandparents and ask them about their childhood and what they heard from their grandparents, you would find that there has been a change. Elopement, it's like this: you have a huge buffet, right? And then you pick up that one bad raita, and then you decide that that is what is the whole buffet about. Or maybe the raita is supposed to tie up with something else, and that's why it's bitter, but you've just picked it up, and therefore it doesn't match with anything. I would see it like that. I feel that texts. I feel that it is an evolution that happens, and like every change, we leave some and we take some. And sometimes what we have taken along might not be the good part. We just grab what is available and take it. So I hope that answers your question. That yes, sometimes you've taken. We have evolved over time, and not every time do we take something that is beautiful, and there's a lot more beauty that we have ignored. So I think that's what all of us actually, in some way or the other, by writing, by performing arts, is what we explore that one bit, like, don't throw the baby with the bathwater kind of a thing. There's so much more to it than what meets the eye.
Any other question?
Hi, ma'am. Thank you so much for that enlightening discussion. Short question is, and a part to it is, any stories where, or let's put a little context. All these stories show elopement where the decision was made and they stuck to it. Any stories where they went after taking the decision, oops? Could be. Could be. Could be anything. And if in the stories, how has that been accommodated, and what has happened when somebody has gone through that kind of oops moment, and the ups and the lows?
I can't really remember any story which ends where, where the woman says oops or the man says oops. But but I think if they end up in marriage, then both sides would be saying oops, oops very often in their entire, journey as such. I don't
Yeah.
know whether Aparna knows
I have
any-
something to add to this. Helen of Troy, she caused a whole war, and that. But finally, she ended up back with the husband. I would say, oops, oops. I don't know what they were doing together for the rest of their lives. And again, you have Theseus and Ariadne. She helps him. She helps him fight with the Minotaur monster, and he finally abandons her. He leaves her and he goes away. And she doesn't know why she eloped with him. What the hell went on in my mind that I fought with my father. I rescued him from a monster. And then finally, this man walks away. And finally, she ends up as a partner to the wine god. I'm sure there are, multiple stories. Mythology is too vast. As I mentioned first, we are not mythologists. I mean, she is somebody who works and researches on Indian mythology. And we do read up on stories, but our grasp on the whole mythology is very limited. There are so many things that we still don't know.
Just on a lighter note, I think when we talk of Shubhadra and Arjuna, where Shubhadra takes the reins, we often, I mean, this is a trope that's enacted in many performances. And one often jokes that he definitely didn't do any backseat driving, and that's why she's stuck on. So,
Hope that answered your question, sir.
Hello. I actually was curious about power in this. Like when we talk about elopement and consent, I think a question that pops up in my head is also the power difference in these different contexts, right? When it's a king and a queen or a princess and a prince, then it not an equal power, but there is at least some power in place that is equitable in some sense. But I do wonder more about stories, and if you know any, I would be really happy to hear more about it. There is a power imbalance, and in that case, can you really call it an elopement of consent, given the kind of structural imbalance in power that could exist in that equation?
Actually, that's a very, very good question. I would like to think. I mean, just sort of take your thought forward. Uh, is elopement when we say she elopes from one situation, she escapes or runs away and goes into another situation? Are we talking about a rearrangement of the power balance, so to say, politically? Yes, I think in the stories of Subhadra and Arjuna, this is exactly what happens. The power balance and the new alliances that are made shift the overall power balance, which then pans out in the war itself. So, her elopement is in mythology has been the one space where women's consent has actually played a significant role, but it has not changed her outcome greatly. It has not made her very powerful, but at that moment, her consent has been acknowledged, because I think what is being acknowledged is her desire. You know, the female desire, which was later clamped down on very heavily, was in the earlier stages being acknowledged, and I think it is also now being acknowledged. But the power shift that happens, I don't, I only see it as a regrouping of power. Yeah.
Can I add to
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
So the story that we did on Chand and Lord, so it is actually so the folios that we took from are from like Lakshmi had mentioned what Maulana Dawud had written, and it is from a a poem called the Chandayan. But the thing is that that is based on an oral folklore, and that is so the folklore goes that I mean the oral story goes that the Lore belongs to the Ahir community. Ahirs are pastoral, they're agrarian, right? So what happens? So the elopement here is just from a story point of view, it is crossing a threshold. So whatever the threshold might be, in this case, it is community threshold that was being crossed. And to make it palatable, it is the male who's crossing the threshold. I mean, as it is, women crossing threshold is difficult to digest. Now, you put in community and everything else into it, it's going to be very difficult for the story to sell. And ultimately, the story has to sell. So small changes are only made, and that's where we brought about, right? That's why this story, by the way, was chosen by Lakshmi. She dug it up from.
I felt, Lore could be played by Ranveer Singh. We could have Alia Bhatt up on a tower. Madhuri Dixit could be the first wife. It plays out so well in a big, Sanjay Leela Bansali production. It just stuck all the chords. So it's not a miracle I picked it up. So I think we will end this evening. Thank you, one and all.